Welcome back to the OK Kiteboarder. Just returning from AWSI 2025, and instead of looking at some of the new gear coming out for 2026, I'd rather like to take a look and have a conversation with a couple of my good friends, Delta George and Ed Junquet, to discuss considerations with downwinding, whether that's SUP foiling or parawinging. I hope you enjoy this conversation they have. It's pretty detailed, but maybe you can just add it into your resources and reference it whenever needed. Hope you enjoy.
These considerations. Come here and get yourself fed. Parawing and SUP foiling with Delta George Ed.
Hi, I'm George from Delta Hydrofoil, and I'm here with Ed Junquet, and we're going to talk a little bit about downwind hydrofoils, the hottest thing in the industry right now, the segment of the designs of the foil design space that's changing most rapidly. And Ed's been helping me with developing foils specifically for downwind because he's crushing it out there, and I'm somewhat old and a little bit more challenged to get it going. Well, I know you've gotten the opportunity to try a great many different manufacturers, and there's a lot of different approaches right now. It really hasn't settled down to one specific thing, like this is what works. I mean, the most obvious one is these very high camber wings, which were pioneered by KT. And now some other manufacturers have taken the same approach. But then there's other people that are kind of taking the more moderate approach with wings that have, you know, much less camber, and I think they're different. They're good for different things. They have different advantages and disadvantages, but I think there also needs to be some compensation in terms of the wing size, that if you go to high camber, you get a huge amount of lift, which allows you to ride a smaller wing. So maybe you could comment on how big of a reduction that would be. Like a conventional wing would be X size and a high camber wing would be Y size. Maybe talk about also wingspan. I think one of the limiting things is, as these wings, everyone's going super high aspect ratio. How high that is can vary a lot. I would call an aspect 10 wing still pretty high aspect, but people are going 16. And when you do that, the wingspan gets really long. There can start to be trouble with maneuverability. And you know, that's one area where the high camber approach kind of works, because you can shrink the wing so you have better maneuverability. But
so from my experience, you know, starting out with the downwind foiling, I was on, I guess, probably around a 10 aspect ratio for when I was learning, maybe even a little lower. And then transitioning in the past like 2 years to these newer wings, getting up to like 13 aspect ratio. I felt that that was a very good like beginner way to get into it, using higher aspect than, like you said, 10. It gives you just that little bit more glide that you want to have when you're making those decisions and reading bumps and trying to navigate the downwind swells. And it also helps you, I think, a little bit on the paddle ups as well, just having that like wider span, and it allows you to maintain better balance on the board, because these downwind boards, just the trend just keeps going narrower and narrower. I think we've gotten to the narrowest point, and now we're starting to work our way back out, which is nice. And it, you know, is very condition dependent. So if you're going to be riding in Hood River, say, or in bay type runs, I think the high aspect isn't necessarily as important as when you're in Hawaii or some more open ocean style bumps.
Or whether you're racing and just trying to pierce through the back of swells.
And if you're trying to pump up and over, you know, that's where you want to get into those smaller wings, and the narrower board plays more of a role. But when you're talking about like for the beginners and deciding on what foil to choose, I think if you're paddling versus parawinging, there's a big difference in your foil choice, because you're going to want to pick something that's going to be pretty easy to paddle up.
Right.
So if you're parawinging and you know you're going to be powered enough, and especially if you're downwinding with the power wing, you can even size up with your power wing, so that way it's just easier to lift off the water. That's going to allow you to start out with a smaller hydrofoil, which may be more conducive to the bumps that you're riding in.
And a much smaller board.
Much smaller board as well.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're learning to paddle, you're going to be on a bigger board. You're going to want to be on a bigger foil, which may not match the speed of the bumps as well. And you know, that's a common thing we see with the guys learning near us in New Jersey, is they want to drop that wing size like as soon as they start learning to paddle up, and we have to like coax them and tell them like, no, just stick with the big wing, keep getting your paddle ups in, peel off the bumps earlier. You know, all these guys that started this downwind hydrofoil revolution were on like the GoFoil Eva wing, 1,500 centimeters, 1.5 inches thick, and they were riding in Hawaii. So like, there's no reason that we can't ride these new like 1,300 centimeter squared wings or 1,400, 1,500 and navigate the bumps and swells and learn on that for a while until we get comfortable.
But I think, you know, as we work together on these designs, like when we size up, like the first prototypes we were working on 875.
Yes.
But I think if we go to that 1,300, which would be suitable for learning and certain conditions, like probably be really good for me as an older person that's not quite as physical. I think we need to drop the aspect ratio down, because like I'd be more than happy to design an 11-13 aspect ratio wing that's a 700 or an 800. But I really wouldn't want to do that on a 1,300, because the thing's going to be 130 centimeters in span, and it's just going to be locked in roll and not be very maneuverable, right?
Absolutely. And then you're also worrying about the wingtips breaching when you're just turning the foil, especially like you're pulling off of the swell. You can imagine like the trough is on the one side and that wingtip is just going to shoot right out of the water. But that, I think when you get into that 13 aspect ratio, you can really get away with less than 1,300 centimeters. I think like that 1,000 to 1,100 is kind of almost as big as you need to go, even in lighter wind conditions, because of the span. Depending on the profile of the wing, you can have pretty good takeoff and pretty good lift. And that's one of the things I've loved about the 875 that you've been developing, is I just feel like it's very stable for its size and it has a great low end. So whether I'm paddling or power winging, I feel very comfortable. Like if the wind's light, I'm gonna be able to get up and going. And that's, you know, half the battle sometimes.
Yeah, and I think there's sort of a very widespread misconception about what aspect ratio really does. So aspect ratio specifically reduces a type of drag called induced drag. And induced drag is really the drag related to the lift of the wing. That in order to make lift, the wing needs to be tilted a little bit leading edge up. So that vector that the wing creates is pointed up. So as the wing tips, that vector points a little bit back, and that's drag. And that's induced drag. So there's nothing that can really be done about that. The other kind of drag is just called parasitic drag, which is the surface friction drag and everything else. And when you're going very slow, the vast majority of drag is the induced drag, because you have to have a high angle of attack when you're going slow, right? But when you're going fast, you ride really flat. So the induced drag goes down and the parasitic drag goes up, because then you're really hauling ass, and that speed creates drag. So the vast majority of the benefit from a high aspect wing is actually at the low end of the speed range. High aspect ratio wings get up on foil better. Now they are better across the entire range. There's never a situation where a high aspect ratio wing is going to perform worse than a low one efficiency wise. But of course, maneuverability and all that need to be taken into account as well. And really, there's two limiting factors to pushing this aspect ratio up and up. One is that the span just tends to get really long and you have the breaching problem, you have maneuverability problems. But the other one is structural, that as these cords get so short that the wing gets very, very thin, and you actually have to increase the thickness as a percentage of the cord to be able to build, because otherwise you have this long wing, it's very thin, and it just gets bendy, and that really messes up the stability. It makes foils that are very, very difficult to ride. So it's a fine compromise, but a lot of people look at these high aspect ratio wings. Oh man, the top end of that's going to be sick. Well, no, I mean, when you look at a high aspect ratio wing, you should be thinking, oh man, the low end of that is going to be sick.
Yeah.
You know, like I'm going to be able to pump up on an 800.
Yep. And also
You know?
the average speed, which is something that comes into big plays. Being able to maintain an average speed, which that would also be conducive to a high aspect wing. Or would the low aspect wing hold better average speed?
I think average speed's kind of tough, and it would depend on the size. So like in aircraft design, there's this thing called the wing loading, which is the amount of weight the wing has to support per surface area. And the interesting thing about wing loading is that the higher the wing loading is, the faster the aircraft has to fly. And it's the same with hydrofoils. So if you're riding a 700 and you're going downwind, you have to go faster.
Yeah.
There's no way to go slow, because the way the lift works is the lift is proportional to the size of the wing, the area of it, multiplied by the velocity squared. So if you have a smaller wing, the speed has to increase in order to make the same, but not as much as you might think, because it's proportional to the area, but it's proportional to the velocity squared. So a small reduction, or say a moderate reduction in the wing area would create a smaller increase in the required speed. But you can feel it pretty easily. There seems to be just kind of a limit where when you go too small, you just can't get up on foil. It's just an absolute struggle.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you make a smaller wing and you really push the aspect ratio, that's going to solve that low end problem.
Yeah. And I think the camber can come into effect there as well.
The camber helps, because what the camber does is it creates a lot of lift even when the wing is riding pretty flat, so that induced drag should be somewhat reduced.
Yeah.
But the camber does some other things that the wing itself, because the trailing edge is curved down, it pitches the wing forward, and the stabilizer needs to compensate for that pitching force. So it's an interesting compromise.
Yeah.
And it's really kind of split in two directions, like either you go this or that. And I've experimented with the high camber a while back, but I was doing it with big wings, like 1450s, 1280s. And for big wings, I didn't like it at all.
Yeah.
It felt very sluggish. And honestly, on a big wing, you don't need the extra lift because you have the area already.
Yeah.
So I think the direction that Kane de Weil has taken to use like a lot of camber, and admittedly a lot more than I would ever think to use,
Yeah.
but just to make the wing smaller.
Yeah.
But then again, as I walk the show, I see people using that camber on bigger wings, and that leaves me scratching my head a little bit,
Yeah.
wondering like, well, you know, it may be applicable to a certain size, but should it be applied to bigger wings as well? And I don't know, maybe. I'm not that experienced as downwinding. You know, the proof is really in the performance of that setup. And if you get up on that setup and you say like, wow, I had a really good time in those conditions, then it works, you know. And I mean, I have a very theoretical background, and I think about these things in that way.
Yeah.
But then I realize that's not the whole story.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and we were discussing this earlier about my preference, you know, as you go through the beginner, intermediate, like more advanced phase. Like I said before, the beginner, like it's nice to have that area and also some span and higher aspect. But as you progress and you want to start, like you said, not just racing, but surfing downwind and enjoying the swells and turning, like almost like you're surfing on a regular wave rather than just the downwind swells, I've liked to lower the aspect ratio. 11 I find is a very good sweet spot, middle ground, 10 to 11, where you have the glide, you have the maneuverability. But even like the 9.5 aspect ratio wings, when you get to a certain level and you know how to read the wind swell to the point where you can just use the energy and you're not pumping as much and you're very efficient with it, that 9.5 aspect ratio can even be just as good or more fun to downwind, because you can just lay over the foil board even more so, which is really fun.
Well, you know, lower aspect ratio allows you to pack in more area into a given span.
Yeah.
You know, and I think like for flat water pumping, you can have a 1.6 meter span wing, and as long as you're careful not to get it too sideways where you can't recover by rolling it back, it's fine. And for flat water pumping, you don't need a huge amount of maneuverability.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. There's also kind of a trend that I like that some brands are doing, where they're kind of packing more of the surface area near the root of the wing and then tapering the wing pretty aggressively towards the tip.
Yeah.
Which then you have less surface area far away from the fuselage, so it doesn't lock the foil in roll as much as it otherwise would. Whereas other wings that have a more gradual taper, you know, with a big span, all of a sudden you've got a lot of surface area really far from the roll axis, and the thing is just like doesn't want to turn. And I think, you know, I went really aggressive on that idea in the 875.
Yeah.
But obviously some other designers are doing that as well. I think it's kind of worthwhile. Theoretically, that's not the most efficient way to distribute the lift on a wing.
Mm-hmm.
Theoretically, it should be distributed elliptically, and that's been proved through calculations and is a well-known thing from designing aircraft wings. But there's all these other considerations in terms of maneuverability. And
what do you think about the leading edge, right? So like, for example, I think like maybe axis, right? It's almost just straight across.
Yeah.
Whereas like some of the more surfier oriented wings, you have like more of a sweep.
Yeah.
How does that play a role with?
Well, sweep beyond like 2.5 degrees, maybe 5 degrees, starts to kill your efficiency.
Okay.
Axis, like with the Spitfire concept that they have, so the maximum lift line is about 30% back from the leading edge. That's where sort of the center of the lift. And what Axis has done is, well, we want that to be a straight line. So they have that as a straight line, which means that the wing is very it looks like a Spitfire airplane. It tapers from the back as well as from the front. Whereas like the wings I've mostly designed have straight trailing edges and then taper back.
Yeah.
But that doesn't create a loss of efficiency so much. I don't know. I think it might influence the feel of it, but I don't think it would influence its performance in terms of its efficiency.
Yeah.
But every foil you get on has kind of a unique feel to it, and I haven't had the opportunity to ride that kind of wing.
Yeah, me neither.
But on the other hand, the 875 is very much like that.
Yeah.
That it might be a little bit tiny little bit swept back, but hardly at all. But
yeah,
a straight wing is more efficient. But on the if you were designing something like for kite foiling where you don't need efficiency because you've got all that power from the kite and the kite's pulling you up, so it's easy to get up on foil. Like sweep makes like a very comfortable cruisy kind of wing that the wing isn't as sensitive to pitch changes. Like if you pitch it up a little bit, its lift doesn't go skyrocketing up. Whereas if you have a very thin straight wing, if you change the pitch of that wing, like the lift is going to go way up.
Okay.
But that might play to pumping too. Like
Yeah.
a swept wing probably wouldn't be very efficient for pumping.
Yeah, and you see that in all these pump foils. They're not.
Yeah, they're very straight.
Yeah.
But I definitely like the idea of putting more surface area towards the center of the wing, and then I think also you might actually get more of an aspect ratio effect than the actual measured aspect ratio, because the wingtips are now super thin. And even though the measured aspect ratio might be 10 or 11, the tips might really look more like an aspect ratio of 13 or 14. And there might be some gain there. So in the end, I think it's really important for designers to work with someone like you and get that feedback.
Yeah.
And, in the past, I've been able to like get up to a reasonable level of kite foiling or wing foiling where I can go out and test the stuff and say, I like it, I don't like it. But with the downwind stuff, I'm just not there. And I need to rely on people that are kind of crushing it out there. I think the Parawing's gonna open it up quite a lot, because if you were paddling up, there would be a requirement to have bigger wings with more camber just to enable you to paddle up onto foil. Whereas with the Parawing, now you've got more power. Like obviously not as much power as you'd have with a kite, but it's more power than a paddle. So that you can get up on foil on a smaller wing and then foil that. But you talked about having wings that could go slower, like for a particular swell condition. Can you talk about that and maybe just put out some ideas for riders of like a typical weight, what you would recommend for a wing size?
So I'm 210 pounds and live in New Jersey, so most of my foiling's done there. We have bay conditions, we have ocean conditions. The bay conditions are obviously a little bit slower, a little bit more like Hood River. With our ocean conditions though, they're not very similar at all to Hawaii or some of these islands that have trade winds and big open ocean wind swell. We have more of a thermal type wind. So it's something to think about, like wherever the person that's getting into this sport, where they're riding. Like, are you riding on Lake Champlain? Are you riding in the Atlantic Ocean? Are you riding in the Pacific Ocean? The Pacific Ocean seems to have a little more fetch on their wind swell, like it blows a little longer, I think. Whereas in New Jersey and the East Coast, I think it's pretty similar, where we get these thermal afternoon winds. So you might get them for 3 hours, you might get them for 6 or 8 hours. And for the most part, you know, you're looking at swell periods of anywhere from as little as 3 seconds that we're riding up to 6, 7 seconds. Whereas, you know, on these trade wind islands, you're looking at 6, 7, 8 second wind swell period. And there's a very big difference. It's not linear, right? In those seconds, it really exponentially speeds up the swells and how fast they're moving. So when we're riding those 3, 4 second swell periods, if you want to ride that 875 wing to tap into, maybe there's a couple of like different swell angles and there's like a 5 or 6 second, it's nice to have a good speed range to be able to enjoy the entire session and not have to pump through certain sections where there's not like that nice, good rolling swell that you can really like get your speed up on. So I find it's important to have a wing that can go decently fast, but for our conditions, it doesn't need to be, you know, racing speeds. It just needs to be able to maybe do like, say 220, 225, 230 kilometers, and then also be able to go in that slower speed range and sit on those 3, 4 second wind swell bumps at like maybe like a 250, 255, 3 minute kilometer. You know, the comfortable foil for me would be like something in 13 aspect ratio in that 860, 875 range. When you're going down to like 9.5 aspect ratio, I feel like it ends up being around 1100 to maybe even 1300 when it's those slower swells. So it really is like, learn where you're gonna ride, figure out what the predominant, like the most common type of swell you're gonna be riding in is, and make a foil choice. And you know, board choice can be important as well. Like you might not need an 8690 board if you're riding in bay type bumps, or in our ocean conditions. We've found that a lot of us are riding like 7-foot boards now for SUPs.
Honestly, I think it's going to be like 5'6" to 5'10" for the Parawing.
For the Parawing, yeah. I ride a 6'3" right now for the Parawing, and just being here and experimenting with smaller and lower liter volume bores, I'm realizing that I probably don't need that long and that much volume. It's that
really probably cool makes it easier to pump too, because you have less board weight. You don't have that inertial thing with the tail and the nose of the board.
You know, less touchdown points on the board. And when you go smaller, it's really fun. It's really exciting right now with the Parawing. I've been doing most of my downwind runs at home on the Parawing. Every once in a while, I'll break out the SUP again, but it's just so fun. So it's just like, it's so hard to put it down when the wind's blowing. You know?
Yeah, I've been winging and trying to like pump on the swell and stuff. And here, when it's really windy, it's pretty easy.
Wing just
but
flies right out.
But back home, it just doesn't have the power in the bay.
Unless
you
you're
know?
like riding blind and the wing is just
Then the
draped
thing,
in front of you.
oh, it's like in your face and all that.
The Parawing really, I think, is the opener for a lot of the guys that were winging. They wanted to get into the paddle downwind, but they saw how long it takes and how much struggle you have to go through, even for like the young guys that are in their 20s learning it.
Yeah, and I think the Parawings will get better so that you can go upwind pretty nicely. And I've actually seen people here rip upwind on the existing designs.
The single skins can go upwind pretty well.
So you don't need the shuttle then, you know, you just sail upwind and then turn downwind, and then you can also just do the circuit on the part of the river or a piece of water that's really nice.
Yeah.
Like when I did it with you, with Vadim in New Jersey, when we kind of got right towards the end of the trip where we were pretty near, where like the swell just started to set up really beautiful. And there was a part where like we were riding and it was really organized, like waves. And I said like, man, I wish the whole trip would have been like that.
Yeah.
But you just kind of fly through it downwind. You enjoyed it for a minute or something and then it's gone.
Yeah.
On a Parawing, you could have just like popped the wing, sail back upwind of it and ride it again.
That's what I did all afternoon yesterday. I went to the hatchery and 2.5 hours of just lapping upwind, downwind, lapping upwind, downwind. And our bay back home is very identical to this, so it's going to be something that I'm definitely going to be doing this
What
winter.
do you think about fuselage length? Like, I've had like a good idea of it. Kind of like occurred to me that there's a fuselage length hierarchy, like windsurf foiling, because the drive force is kind of above your head in the sail on the windsurfer. That forward drive force forces the nose down, and the stabilizer needs to compensate for that. So the fuselages are like 1 meter long on these things.
Yeah.
And then the next thing's kind of like the wing foil, where the drive's kind of at your shoulders because that's where they attach to your body, right?
Yeah.
So now it's gone from being above your head to being shoulder height, and the fuselages shrink a little bit.
Yep.
You know, with the kite foiling, it's at your harness, at your belly. So now it's moved down another foot and it's shorter for the same reason. And for the downwind paddling, you're basically gliding down a slope like if you're skiing or snowboarding.
Yes.
So the forward force is just your center of gravity being slightly in front of the center of lift.
Yeah.
So there's very little nose down. And then, so it creates an opportunity to ride really small fuselages.
That's my favorite.
And then what we found with the kite foil racing designs, like back, I don't know, 8 years ago, Levitas came out with a kite racing foil that had an extremely long fuselage and tiny little stabilizers. And if you kind of did the theoretical calculations, having like a big lever arm and a small amount of downforce should be super efficient, much, much better than a shorter fuselage with more stabilizer downforce. And it wasn't faster. It didn't work. Like the shorter fuselages were actually better, faster. And
your thought is
the fuselage itself is pretty draggy.
Yeah.
And so I think shortening up fuselages is a pretty good idea. And I don't know, I'm kind of at odds with consensus thought on stabilizers. I've always kind of liked bigger stabilizers for the stability. But obviously I've been bucking the trend because people have gone to really small ones and seem to be able to make it work.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think, you know, I wasn't really, when I was opposed to really small stabilizers, that was more for winging and kiting. But now with downwind paddling, because of that same reduction that we talked about, the drive force moving down, 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 like with pump foiling, there's really none of that nose down pitching moment at all.
Yeah.
So I think you can, I mean, people are doing it. There's no question you can use pretty small stabilizers, pretty small fuselages, get the drag down, and then really, you know, any improvement that we can make in drag reduction is just going to make it easier to connect swell.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, it's kind of exhausting when you're in weak conditions and you're like trying to surf down some little thing and you think it's going to hold you up, and it does for a little bit and then it doesn't. And then you're pumping to the next little thing.
Yep.
And when you finally get it, like it just kind of fades under you and you got to pump some more. Like, you know, in order to just facilitate that being more efficient, that might really change the sport and make it accessible to a lot more people.
Yeah, and like to speak to both the fuselage and tail, it's same kind of thing I was talking about before, beginner, intermediate, advanced, right? I think that longer stabilizer, even though you're talking about the drive forces coming from, that longer stabilizer is still going to help that beginner person.
Just in terms of making it easier to ride.
Having, more stability, probably a little more down, being able to put a little bit more downward pressure on the foil to pump it, like and just feeling more stable. Same thing with like a bigger stabilizer. You're going to have more stability, easier to pump, more drag.
Yeah.
But like I said before, guys were downwinding on 1,500 centimeter, 1.5 inch foils, and they're making it work. So you can make it work as you're learning and getting better, and then slowly, drop down in fuselage length or tail length. Probably one at a time would be best. Me personally, I like to go. I was riding your short fuselage with whatever foils I ride. I pretty much just ride the short, and that's, like you said, better efficiency, and then also maneuverability. I'm able to make snappier turns and just drive the foil around a little bit faster.
Yeah, and you convinced me to make you a 135 stabilizer.
And the 135 stabilizer, maybe it's only a few small percent difference in glide and efficiency, but once again, same thing, it loosens it up even more. And I don't feel like I'm missing anything on any of the pump or anything like that, which would be the only reason I would ride a bigger stabilizer, is just, a little more lift or a little more better.
Yeah, I don't think that, there's this sort of some thought that you get propulsion from the stabilizer as you pump, like sort of like a fish, but I don't think that that's actually true.
Okay.
I think, people have tried all different kinds of things. Nick Leeson did this really experimental thing where he made the rear of the fuselage actually flexible. He flattened it out like a pancake so it could bend up and down, so he could get kind of like...
The wingtips or the rear of it?
The fuselage itself. Oh, he flattened it, so it was wide but super thin.
Yeah.
So it would actually bend where the stabilizer was, sort of to try to get that. And unfortunately, what happens is that the stabilizer no longer works as a stabilizer because it's just but a lot of interesting things have been tried. So almost to my mind, I would think that a big stabilizer and a long fuselage would be an impediment to being able to change the pitch of the wing during the pump quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like I walked the show and it kind of got me discouraged. A few years ago, I could walk the show and said well, I can do better than that. And that's definitely not the best way to do that. Now I walk the show, it's all the stuff's really good. I'm screwed. How do I improve on this? But I think, it's just a few months ago that I started thinking about the downwind stuff. First of all, because it's the hot ticket item in the industry, but also just because I needed a challenge, to, set my mind on figuring this thing out.
Yeah.
Because I really think that wing foil design and kite foil design is pretty much completed.
Yeah.
It's always going to be small improvements, gradual over a period of time, but we've reached kind of a consensus on that.
Yeah.
A lot of foils, there's no crazy looking foils at this show. Everything looks like sort of most other things.
And what you expect.
Yeah. So, although a few years ago I made a biplane foil, I took 2 wings and stacked them up. It was terrible, man. It was awful. It had twice the wing area, but maybe 25% more lift, and the drag was incredible. But man, that thing was when it was moving, it was locked in the water. It was
no roll.
Yeah. All right. Well, why don't you just do some recommendations for riders of different sizes for if they're looking to get into downwinding?
So, for riders looking to get into it, if you're looking at SUP foiling, I recommend going, if you take your kilos and body weight, I think James Casey came up with this, you multiply it times 1.3 or 1.4 for the volume in the board.
Okay.
Seems pretty aggressive, a 100 kilogram rider. I'm just a little bit tad of that, or a little shy of that. You're looking at 130 to 140 liter board. And honestly, my SUP is about 130, 135 liters still to this day. I just like the ease of use of balancing on it. It's great, gets off the water. So you really don't need to downsize from that anytime soon, which is nice. So if you're getting into SUP foiling, like I said, 1.3, 1.4 times your body weight in kilograms, that's a good base point for the board. For paddles, heavier riders probably are gonna be better off with a bigger blade. So I know the Quick Blade and some of these brands that make large blades, it's about 100 square centimeters of blade size. I ride now like about an 85 centimeter. So I've dropped down in size, even though I'm a heavier rider. I don't feel like I necessarily need it. The only downside to the bigger blades is it's gonna be a little more pressure on your shoulders when you're paddling. But if you don't have great paddle technique, that bigger blade size does help and picks up some of your loss efficiency in your paddle strokes. With foils and mast length, I always recommend the 75 centimeter, just 10 centimeters less drag than an 85 centimeter when it's in the water and when you're trying to paddle up. And as a beginner, that is pretty big. You can get away with the 80 centimeter or 78 or 77, whatever it is. It's not gonna be as drastic as 75 to 85. And then foil size, like I said, it's gonna be very condition dependent. So if you're in Hawaii, you're still gonna probably have to start out on a bigger wing, but I probably wouldn't say bigger than 1100. If you're in the East Coast of the United States, I think 1300 is a great starting point, 1300 square centimeters, even if you're a 140 pound, 150 pound rider. Like all the guys that are learning right now, we ad nauseum tell them like stick with the 1300 size foil, keep paddling up, keep learning to read the bumps and kicking out. You're just getting more reps of like transitioning from bump to bump and swell to swell. And then when we're talking back in the parawing, I think for beginners with that, they're recommending like I guess it would be like 1.1 to 1.2 times your body weight in kilograms. So I guess like 100 kilogram rider again, just because it's easy math, you're looking at a 110, 120 liter board. And I don't think that the SUP foil boards are conducive for it. So unfortunately, there's no one quiver killer for it. I've been experimenting with it. Those longer boards that are meant for SUP foiling, they just track way too well and way too fast. And they're a little bit too narrow for parawing. So when you're going to get up with the parawing, you're already coming up on foil. And it's not conducive to learning. I think it's really beneficial to be on a little bit wider of a board. So, and I didn't talk about width on the SUPs. Widths on the SUPs can range from anywhere from like 16 to maybe 21. And just obviously more beginner, more wider is gonna be better.
Do you think you could do the parawing on a wing board if you had one already?
You can, but it's gonna be a much steeper learning curve for you if you're trying to go on anything wider than probably 23 inches, I think.
Yeah, that's pretty normal width.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the old style wing boards.
Yeah, no, you don't want that.
Yeah, if you got guys that are still on those 5/6 by 28s, I think you're going to be wasting a lot of time and energy to try and make that work. But yeah, the wing boards that are coming out like the past year or two that are like anywhere from 20 inches wide to 23 inches wide, I think those are really good.
Yeah, I think 22 to 23 for wing foiling is perfect.
Yeah.
At like 5'4" to 5'6", something like that.
I think the wing is nice hand wing because you can pump it a little bit more. With the parawing, you want a little bit longer, a little bit narrower.
Do you think the mid-length boards are good for parawing then?
I think the mid-length boards are perfect for parawing. Yeah. I was riding the North Midi for a while, 96 liters, so it's equal to my body weight, and that was fantastic. I've been riding the KT Super K now, same thing, 95 liters, it's equal to my body weight. I think it's fantastic. They both released off the water really well, only about 21 inches wide. I think the KT's a little shy, 21. But yeah, so like that math for the mid-length board or wing-ish board would be like starting out a little bit more than your body weight by like 10%, 20%. And then foil choice is kind of similar, but you might not have to start out on as big of a foil, which is nice. You could start out on like, instead of a 1300 by us, maybe an 1100 would cut it for you as long as it has good low end and good glide.
Yeah, I think at 1300 or 1100, you'd be looking more like 8 or 9 aspect ratio rather than 11 or 13.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure. But and I think that that's kind of what a lot of guys already have in the quiver. You know, most people don't have the 13 aspect. If you're coming from winging, like I don't see why you would have a 13 aspect ratio foil at that time. So I'm just talking to like what they might have right now, and then parawings in general, like what you're going to be holding on to. Same thing, like super condition dependent. Like what winds are you going to be predominantly riding in? And you know, in New Jersey in the summer, it's a 5 meter or 4 meter pretty much all summer long with a hand wing and with a parawing. In the wintertime, you're looking at 1.7 to probably 3 meter range for us.
Okay.
You know, and that's going to be condition dependent on your wind speed. So, you know, not as easy to get going as a wing. So like you kind of want to see a little more wind while you're going out. So like for the 5 meter and 4 meters, you want to really, especially when you're first learning, you want to see that 15 to 20 range. If it's not consistently blowing above 15, you're gonna be struggling. And
so would you say like you'd have to be good on a 4.5 meter wing in order to make a parawing work?
When you're learning, yeah. I think so. You know, I've had the 5 meter out in like 13 to 18 and it's comfortable, but that was after numerous sessions and good experience on taking off with the board and, you know, pumping my legs and using the swells a little bit as well. So it's tricky when you're going from flat water. You might be able to even get away with a little less wind almost, because once you're in that chop, if you're not able to navigate it and use your legs and the board speed and the swells to build it, it can just kind of stunt you and stop every time you go to get up and you just run into the back of a bump.
Well, you know, it's been great talking with someone as knowledgeable as Ed, and it's kind of a good combination. You got the nerd with like all the book learning, and you got the guy that's actually doing it.
Yeah, it's been fun to talk.
So, you know, we look forward to collaborating together, and hopefully we'll have some products out there for doing some downwinding next year from Delta, which we're super excited about. So Ed and Delta George closing out from AWSI 2025.
With Delta George and Ed. Foil up, wing high, let it begin.